is the digital forensic expert and what is their expertise? That's the question posed in a new paper published at Wire's Forensic Science. The paper explores the concept of a digital forensic expert witness while also considering whether this term may now be potentially misleading to judges, attorneys, and others outside of this domain. This week on the Forensic Focus podcast, we're rejoined by both authors, Graeme Horsman and Brett Shavers. Graeme recently transferred from his lecturer role at Teesside University to an academic role at Cranfield University. And Brett is a private sector forensic analyst and consultant known for the books he's authored and his website, dfir.training. I'm your podcast host, Krista Miller. Gentlemen, welcome back.
Thanks for having us.
So to start with, where exactly did this article come from? Was it personal experience or things you noticed other people talking about in the community, a mix or other factors in it?
So I don't know, I'll go first.
Yes.
So from my perspective, I think it's really important that I've got the academic, my eyes are academic in this. So that's my viewpoint on it. I'm not a practicing practitioner anymore or anything like that. So my observations here are sort of not targeted at anyone in particular. I'm not having a go with people or anything like that. What it is it's my observations of the classification of when the use of the term expert that I've seen, you know, in literature, in practice, and I've seen it used as a term quite often in our field, and it's not just our field; it's used in a term in all sorts of fields. So my original observations were based on, well, what does that term? What does expert mean? What does our field mean? And anyone that's in our field knows that it is huge, and it's got lots of different areas and aspects to it. And I only know little bits about little things, if that makes sense. I certainly don't consider myself to know half of the things that this field entails in terms of analysis, but it doesn't make it intrigued me the fact that you might want to stick an expert title on that. And I was thinking, would I stick an expert title on my knowledge, and why and when would I put that on there? So that kind of got the ball rolling in terms of my interest. But I obviously I sit behind an academic desk. So I don't think I can bring everything to the table here. So I was really interested to reach out to Brett, who brings a heck of a lot more experience to it than what I do, and a different insight from loads of different angles. So I guess I had a curiosity, and I felt that there was some areas to tease out in terms of, you know, maybe we should explore this in a little bit more, and what does expertise mean, and particularly with our field that is massive and vast, and Brett is, you know, practicing in this area, has got way more experience than me. So I reached out to Brett, and I wanted his viewpoint on this as well. So maybe Brett's probably got some points as well that he kind of feels where he might come from on this topic as well.
Yeah, like I said, I'm flattered that he asked me for my opinion, I guess, for that. But yeah, I looked at it from the other aspect. I just gave some perspectives from the practitioner, I guess. You know, that I'm from being on the hot seat, I guess, as an expert, and the things that I've seen, and that's kind of where we kind of merge the academic view versus, you know, the guy in the hot seat getting questioned on expertise. So it was a great paper that he had an idea with, and I just really just gave a few ideas to a lot of his writing.
So my next question is on that note, how often you've each been approached to testify? So Graeme, it doesn't sound like you have at all. So Brett, for what expertise? I know I think you've testified quite frequently as an expert witness. In what regards, and the sort of what as we're watching the field mature and diversify in different aspects of digital forensics, including multimedia, et cetera, what expertise have you contributed to expert witness testimony, and then you know, where are you kind of seeing requests come in now?
Well, I think it depends on the engagement, I guess, for one. And on the private side, well, let me back up a second. So in law enforcement, you know, I've been subpoenaed probably 3 or 4 times a week for years.
Wow.
But not all of those go to trial, obviously.
Sure.
And then because, you know, so many plead out or cases are dismissed or those sort of things. And even testifying with those, almost none of them, I mean, very rarely were there expertise testimony required in law enforcement, because it's not really necessary. And then in the private sector, And I'm just talking from my experience and people that I spoke to that work like I do. With the initial engagement, it's usually the attorney's strategy, I guess. Do I want to hire an expert,
Right.
or do I want to have a consultant? Because there's a lot of legal ramifications with that. You have work product discoverability and materials and all these other things that are going on, and conversations between the client and the expert or the consultant. So that really depends on the strategy of the case and the engagement. So there's been many where you engage as just a consultant that would turn into an expert witness, or vice versa. So it really depends on the engagement. And even then, going to trial, there's only been of all the testimony, I think the percentage of actually qualifying for an expert is low compared to testifying in general, just because it's not necessary in many cases. It's your fact witness testimony of this is what I saw, this is what I did, this is my report, is usually enough. It's just when if the court's confused with bickering witnesses, when conflicting testimony, that's when an expert witness really starts to come into play with, well, let's try to solve what we think is going on here. So as far as the number of times, I think it's small in percentage wise.
Okay. One thing you mentioned briefly in the article was the risk of liability for a forensic practitioner who's testifying as an expert. What is that risk? I think you mentioned miscarriage of justice, but are like within that, are there kind of different factors that are going into that?
I was just going to provide like a brief overview. I was thinking it would depend on jurisdiction, I imagine. Where you're operating and where you're practicing as to what quite you would be subject to from your pure definition of your expertise or your misjudgment of your expertise and the product that you produce, I guess. But Brett, if you want to, I don't know if you were about to expand upon that.
Yeah, I mean, we have the personal reputation liability.
Yeah,
if you're claiming to be an expert and you're not, or if you're a fraud, number one, but also if you claim to be an expert and you're not fraudulently pushing the boundaries, but you're taking on more than what you should be taking because you're kind of risking your reputation in that way. And as far as miscarriage of justice, I mean, people lie, and they lie in court, they lie under oath. So that would be obviously gross miscarriage of justice if you have an expert who is lying to win, and that's ethical. Topic, of course, but that happens. So that's the liability. But if you're truthful in what you're doing and you're factual, then really the liability should not exist. It's just that if you're going beyond, either inadvertently or intentionally, that's the problem.
Yeah, makes sense. With that in mind, getting more into the substance of the paper, you wrote about expert obligations to define the scope of their expertise, particularly given attorneys who only minimally vet experts they hire. So given that a single crime can touch multiple operating systems, databases, memory, video, pictures, et cetera, what's a reasonable balance between generalist and specialist practices?
Well, I guess
I think this is difficult.
Yeah, I think the balance is it's so much rest on the witness.
Okay.
Because and now let's do the private sector, I guess, version first, whether you have an attorney, because usually it's an attorney, right, who may or may not have a lot of computer knowledge other than turning on a computer and maybe some I know what e-discovery is, I know what metadata is, that sort of thing. And then when they're hiring an expert and looking at a resume, it says expert, right? In many attorneys' eyes, that means expert in all things computers. So it's up to the expert or the witness who may be qualified as an expert to say, yeah, I'm an expert in Windows, for example, but not Linux or not Sun systems or not whatever. It's up to that expert to really balance. If you get me on the stand, I can testify for these things, but these things you're going to need somebody else. So I think the balance is the expert to determine. The attorney's not going to be able to determine how good of an expert you are, because they're going to naturally assume that you're an expert in everything. And just as a quick aside, in one case where I was testifying for a deletion expert in a specific thing for deletions, And going through qualifications in court, I was qualified as a computer forensic expert. I mean, all things expert. And even I'm telling the attorney, I'm just talking about this one thing, not all things, but the court qualification came out to be an expert in all things. And obviously I'm not an expert in all things, but that's something on attorneys.
So I guess another way to ask that is, how deep should a practitioner's expertise get to be considered courtroom ready expertise? Or does it even matter, Brett? I mean, it sounds like based on that one example that that maybe it's not as much of a big deal, or maybe it should be a bigger deal.
Well, I guess it depends on the case, I guess, on what you're testifying to, you know, how deep you're going to go for being an expert. If it's really specific, obviously you want to be very specific, but if it's not very specific, if it's just general internet browser history, for example, that's kind of across the board, you can really cover a lot. But if it's something very specific to an OS or very specific to a certain artifact, then I guess it really depends on the case, on the evidence that's being questioned.
Okay. So another term that came up in the paper was knowledge creep, which you defined as the act of overstating their expertise by assuming they possess knowledge that actually exists beyond their current remit. They meaning forensic practitioners. Could you give a few examples of what's a reasonable extension of knowledge versus an overextension?
I think that the knowledge creep concept is I think really straightforward as a concept, but really difficult to evidence in sort of the way that you're suggesting there. So the idea is that you can assume knowledge based upon linkage, if that makes sense. So, you know, I've examined a browser before. I know all browsers, you know, because they all allow me to access the internet, for example. But actually, in reality, that's not the case. Artifact types will be different. You know, maybe the high level processes will be very similar, but your interpretation of what that looks like on a disk is maybe requires a little bit more knowledge. So knowledge creep is this maybe this idea that you can assume knowledge of something because you've seen it before in a what you might think is a related entity, but actually there are different aspects to it. So maybe, you know, I examined version 1 of Chrome, and actually now we're on version 20, and you might assume that you know Chrome because you've seen Chrome prior to this. But actually, you know, in the 19 version iterations that you've seen from there, we've got some substantial differences in the way that browser operates and stores trace evidence on the disk, for example. So that's the concept of knowledge creep. Okay. When do I think this is really difficult? Because you essentially open yourself up a little bit, and actually you've got to make this decision, I think, on an individual basis, and everyone has to be honest and open and evaluative of their own knowledge. But I think ultimately you have to think, what is an acceptable level of it? And you have to manage that yourself. So maybe I've seen version 2 of Chrome, and I'm now examining version 3 of Chrome. I think you could probably assume that that might be a safe level of creep, and that you still need to evaluate and assess your bit of knowledge there for that additional browser. But if you're assuming that I've seen Safari, but I'm going to examine Opera, I don't know. This is a very basic example. Yeah. You know, you can't. That to me is probably an exacerbated creep of knowledge, I think. You know, I know all browsers because I've seen one. And I think what you will see that is that leap will be much smaller in reality. But I think we just need to be careful. And I think really the concept is there to sort of say, look, be careful. You know, just because you've seen it in one form, things can massively change. And I guess, you know, let's say even just one variation between an iteration of an app or something like that. If they choose to fundamentally change the type of storage or login mechanism, you know, you might be starting again from your interpretation of that app's trace. You know, if they went from, I don't know, if they went from one database type to a totally different flavor or different login style. So even the version type between apps, you know, it's a very arbitrary way of defining creep, and you might think on paper it's not a lot, but it could be massive. So which is where your question's really difficult. And I'm not even sure that it can be answered. I think every practitioner has to sort of think, right, you know, does this look like something that I've seen before? And then I think the only real way that we can combat it is the good ability to test, validate, reconstruct, you know, assess our own understanding of the trace. And that's slightly a different a different issue. But I think it's a concept that where we might subconsciously assume knowledge of something because we've seen it, and actually we just need to step back and think, but have I seen this in enough detail to really fully understand it? Or am I at a conceptual level, or, you know, that sort of thing? That's what I think. That's probably how I would describe it. I don't know if I've answered your question, but I think I have.
Yeah, I think we're kind of getting into more of a professional development, career tracking sort of realm. And one thing that stuck out to me in the paper was your suggestion that practitioners should conduct genuine self-suitability assessments before offering services as expert witnesses, or at least accepting an attorney's approach. So I wanted to find out, like, how I guess that first step in developing that expertise is the assessment. Does it consist of the framework that you set out in the article? I maintain expertise in the areas of acquired via and evidenceable through a particular means, or is it something deeper? I mean, you also mentioned the case outcomes, practitioner capacity, contributions to the community, et cetera. What's the mix there of that kind of self-suitability assessment, and how often should assessments like this be conducted?
Okay, that's quite a big question.
I
think it's, I don't think there's one answer to it. And I think it's about defining your knowledge and objectively being able to evidence it. And I don't think that there is a set of objectively criteria that you would roll out on every instance, but obviously you can think of some that would be more useful than others. You don't, I don't think it's about quantity. You know, you don't have to have 100 to be amazing at something. I think it's about the quality of the objective evidence that you can put forward. But I do think that, I think Brett said at the start about, you know, I'm a computer expert. Well, computers are exceptionally complex, wide variety. You know, we can infinitely increase the capability and capacity of our computers. So we don't know everything about them, which is why I think when it's the self-assessment, it's like, well, what do I know in enough detail to be good at knowing that bit of that computer? And if I think I'm good at it, and I think I'm an expert at it, well, if someone says, well, why do you think that? Then I need to be able to bring back something to this table and say, well, I'm an expert because I've done this. And that could be formal qualifications, but again, we have to be tentative around formal qualifications. It could be, you know, testing and validation, and, you know, got to be conscious about that. Could be I published a paper or something and I've developed a method that's now being used by, you know, X, Y, and Z, but we maybe have to be conscious of that. I think everything has to have be evaluated for quality, but I think there has to be something bar just saying, you know, that I know these little bits. I think we need to move to this point where, I think we need to move to it, but I think it would be good practice to sort of get into the habit of the generic, I'm an expert in this big sphere of ability, to thinking, well, actually, no, what am I? What little morsels of parts of it am I good at, and why am I good at them? So qualifications would be good, but obviously a lot of qualifications provide you with a grounding, but not necessarily specific expertise. You might have gone on to write a book in that area, or you might have gone on to produce a method that the community thinks is the bee's knees in terms of how we do something. There'll be ways to evidence it. I think what we need to, I think the flip side of the coin would be, I'm an expert in this. Well, why? Because I think I am, or, you know, I've done a case in this before, which is great. You know, you've done a case in that before, but, you know, that's not necessarily as, you know, you assume that case was brilliant and went right, and, you know, you did everything perfectly, but you might need to think a little bit more around how you would evidence that, bar that single one previous look at it or something like that. Does that kind of make sense? And maybe Brett has kind of more more thought on this than I put forward there.
I think yeah, it's a combination of everything that you've done and are doing, and like I said, writing books or teaching or developing processes, all those lead to expertise. But I guess there's a small point about expertise and court, I guess. Let me try to bring it back to a court. So there's kind of like a banter among us, the field of who's an expert. Either nobody's an expert because you're not smarter than me, or not smarter than that person. And then nobody should be an expert because that's it's arrogant or whatever, and those things. And so we'll never know everything. Therefore, you can never be an expert.
Mm.
So I think that thinking of you can never be an expert because it's infinite knowledge with computers. It's infinite, things that revolve around computers. But I think for the expertise or the qualification of an expert, it's a judge or magistrate or a court saying, yeah, you're an expert. Because we need your opinion to help find facts in this case.
Mhm.
So it really comes down to the court saying you're an expert. For like Graeme saying, someone to say I'm an expert. Well, it's kind of meaningless because I am saying I'm an expert. Who's going to debate me? It doesn't really mean anything. And I mean, expertise and I think practically is it's like if we're all reading the same book. And Graeme is one chapter ahead of us. Well, practically he's an expert because he knows a chapter ahead of everybody else. So practically he's an expert, whether it be how to fix a car or a computer. In court, if you know more than the court, if you know more than the judge, more than the attorneys, and at least as much as your opposing expert or witness, then practically you're an expert. So I think for us personally, we really dive deep in becoming an expert. We really take a lot of training. We really read a lot of books. We do a lot of practice. We do a lot of those things. So I think a lot of us could be qualified as experts in court just because of the work that we do intently. But we really put ourselves down on how much we know because we know how much we don't know.
Yeah.
So, but going into a trial and typically they're not so, it's not that difficult to be qualified as an expert in court. It's very simple. It's that, I mean, the bar is low. Do you know more than the average, the lay person? If you know more than the lay person, well, you're an expert. I mean, that's what it comes down to. So you may not have ever examined Windows 11, but if you've done Windows 10, I think theoretically you could still be an expert in court to testify on your first case of Windows 11 because you've done so much on Windows 10 and prior. So I think what Graeme's saying, all these things to do to create your expertise for that, and I say opportunity to be, because not everyone goes to court to testify.
Right.
I mean, we have so many people who never testify, never have to testify. Their job doesn't require testifying, and even those who do testify, as consultants or in a case, very few of those will qualify as an expert because it's not needed. It's well, we trust your report, we trust what you're saying.
Okay.
It's true. So why would we need your opinion? So for the court qualified experts, I think they're fewer than the ocean of experts, because there's a lot of experts out here because Graeme's an expert, obviously, in many things because of everything he's done, and you're an expert in many things. And so as far as building expertise, I think we all build it by the work we do, the things we read, the things we write, the work, that we're documenting and researching. So we're all building toward expertise. It's just that what is an expert, the court qualification is the only differentiating factor that I see.
So I guess with that in mind, when as practitioners are looking at their professional development, do you feel that they should be conducting their operational work with an eye towards qualifying and testifying as an expert witness in a particular area, say, whether it's Windows forensics or memory forensics or whatever, or does it really, is it sort of ancillary to like the main mission, I guess, of what digital forensics is all about?
I guess as a practitioner, I never have looked at, just personally my opinion, looked at becoming an expert in anything. Okay. It's I've never said, well, I'm going to prepare for a trial. I don't want to be qualified expert in this subject, so I'm going to work toward that subject. I've never done that just because I don't know what the next case is going to be or what the next trial is going to be. So if I'm memory forensics, for example, well, I want to qualify as an expert as memory forensics, so I'm going to dive deep in memory forensics. For that, I may never ever go to trial for memory forensics ever. I'm going to build up my expertise just in case, but if that's my goal and intention, I'm going to be really disappointed all the time. And I don't think that's going to be a good way. So the way I look at it is if I have a case that's like a recently file copy, was a file copied, when who did it kind of thing. If that case I'm engaged with, then I'm going to really dive deep into that subject matter, because it's going to trial. It may not go to trial, but it's going to go to trial. It's headed toward trial. So that I will work to become an expert on, not for the sake of becoming, I want to be qualified as an expert, get a gold star. It's because I want to know what I'm talking about when I'm testifying and when I'm doing it. So I would do, that's the only way I look for working toward expertise, is there's a goal and a mission, there's an end product that I need to do, whether I reach that or not, it's headed that direction. So personally, I don't think it's a good idea to pick a topic for the sole goal of being a court qualified expert, because it may never happen.
Okay. Kind of on that note, actually, you made a point earlier that few cases ever make it to trial, at least in the United States. So for experts or practitioners who are interested in potentially becoming qualified as expert witnesses, how can they obtain that testimonial experience? Are there moot courts that they can participate now, or if they're just not, should there be? And not just for the experts, but for the lawyers as well, to be able to practice asking questions.
I guess the only way to get experience qualifying as an expert is to be on the stand. I think that's probably the first way, but to get there, I think there's pretty few courses and training in mock testimony. And I don't know why, other than it's not exciting, it's not, and it's embarrassing. It's to be cross-examined on the stand is not fun whatsoever, because your integrity is questioned, your credibility is questioned, you're insulted. I mean, all these things can happen, and if we're honest, we say what we feel and mean, and we're true, and then we're getting attacked for it. It's not a comfortable feeling. So the experience, I think, to have and I remember there was a course on expert witness testimony. I forgot who put it on, but it didn't last long. And I think it's because maybe people don't want to go pay to get beat up. Here's $1,000, beat me up. I mean, it's a good thing to do, obviously.
I would think that you would want to do it in kind of a training controlled setting rather than like actually at trial.
Yep, but it's easier to put off the pain just in case you don't need it. But trial prep sometimes includes the attorney prepping, but even then it's not a mock trial. It's more of a sit down of, okay, here's some questions, here's some tips. Basically, it's not really mock trial for a lot of trial prep. So that's a drawback there. And I mean, even police academies, there's a little bit of a court testimony practice, but not a whole lot. We're all into data. That's every course is data. We have very little in ethics, very little in testimony. It's all about data, and as if that solves all the problems. But it's in trial the data is great, but if you're not testifying well enough, it's meaningless. So as far as to get that practice, you got to do cases, and you have to hope those cases go to trial, and you got to hope that your prosecutor, your client is going to prep you, and then you go do it.
That's I can imagine for training wise, that's a challenge in terms of, I mean, you mentioned throughout the paper that technology is changing so rapidly. So it's either, focus on the rapidly changing data or the kind of structural supports around it, maybe, or around the justice system when it comes to the data.
So I think, you'd be less likely to catch up with technology in terms of knowing every little bit, but if you're very good at your ability to test, validate, interpret, and those core skills of, if I don't know something, how do I find out? And the find out bit, you do really well, and you can always do it really well. Then, you're never going to know everything, but if you have the skills to find out, then I think that bridges the gap. If someone brings me a phone tomorrow and I've never seen an app on it that but I need to investigate it, I'd like to think I've got the skills to test, validate, and run through the functionality and pick apart the bones of it. And I think that's the gap bridger. You shouldn't have to have seen app A 100 million times and gone through you can see it once, but once might be enough if you've really picked it apart and validated it and interpreted it.
Final question. So, we've been talking about individual experts and their expertise particularly. And, we talked a little bit about professional development. You wrote about training and certification together with casework and research that make for expertise. But as you also stated, this is a moving target. So to what extent should practitioners really focus on building their own expertise versus connecting with other experts that they can recommend when an attorney needs it?
So I'll go first. I'll have a little go at this question. And I think that there's an element of experience gathering, hopefully of good, positive experiences, because obviously that's the thing with experience. And, you could gather bad experience, but you don't know it's bad at the time, or vice versa. And obviously you can gather objective qualifications, which you can evidence objectively, and those sorts of things. I think from a skill perspective, it is kind of those skills that allow you to find things out and find them out reliably that will help build your expertise, and it will help stop you from becoming stuck with, I only know this and I can't get any further. You should never be in a position, I don't think, where you can't become better because you can't afford to go on a training course or something like that. I think you can still gather and become a good practitioner and gather expert knowledge by being good at fundamentally learning how things function, the reverse engineering of data on media, why it's there, how it's there, coming to reliable conclusions from being able to test and evaluate the traces and what they mean. So I think that you shouldn't be pigeonholed into a box because you can't afford to get out of it. I don't think this is a money thing. I think this is what are the fundamental skills does a practitioner need to get more knowledge and get it reliably. And you can engage with the community in lots of different ways and develop methods from your own testing and evaluation and have them critically evaluated and by other peers in the community and things like that. So you can increase your ability that way. But I think the second part of your question there was about sort of, well, how do I get the right expert? Is that my interpretation correctly? How do you know you're the right expert for the job? Is that what you kind of mean?
Yeah, that and how do you make sure that the client gets the expertise that they need, even if you're not the one that can supply it?
So I think that it's the self-assessment, isn't it? In some respect, it's the knowledge creep, the self-assessment, it's everything rolled into one. It's I've got a job, a case, and I think it's on this. They may not know the full details of it, but they know probably what they want in some respect, or at least a starting point. It's that critical evaluation of you. And because of all the things Brett said previously, you don't want to necessarily run into this and be like, yeah, I'll do it, and then get there and maybe you can't, or you can't do it as good as you should be able to do it. It's sitting down thinking, am I the person for that job, and do I have the objectively evidenceable knowledge that and the knowledge to go with that I can do this, and if I can't, maybe it's sort of stepping back from it and saying, you know what, I'm not that person, but I do maybe know someone who is that person, rather than maybe saying, well, do you know what, maybe I'll just try and gather that knowledge on the way through this case or something like that. So it's a difficult one. It's that real critical self-assessment, I think, of saying, you know what, all other factors aside, can I do this? And not just can I do it, because anyone can do it. It's can I do it to the standard that I need to do it to, and not just, I don't think we're in the discipline where have a go is a good idea necessarily. All of that, you're having a go because you've got the skills and ability to do the job effectively and quality standards are maintained. If it's a fishing trip to just see if I can do it, that might have some more consequences. And maybe Brett also has some views on this as well. But I'll pass it over to Brett just to see if he has any other views too.
Yeah, well, one thing on being an expert, expert seems to be a dirty word. I think online people say I'm an expert, and you get kind of slammed for saying that. And I've never claimed to be an expert. I've only said I've been qualified as an expert in court. That's it. That's personally, that's all that matters to me anyway. But being an expert is kind of I'm not going to say arrogant, but it's you're exuding some confidence that you know something. So it's kind of like it's a strong personality trait you got to be able to have to say I'm willing to be qualified as an expert, or I know this. But within that expertise, there's that humility you must have that says, but I'm not an expert in this subject, Or I know internet browsers. However, my expertise stops at this level because I don't know this internet browser. I don't know it on this system. I don't know this version. So you have to have the ability to say, yeah, I do know A, but I will pull back myself when it gets to B or C. I don't know that far. So that's the part of being an expert. And I've seen those who say I'm an expert in A, and then when they reach B or C or D, they just keep going, claiming expertise without having it. What that does, that negates expertise across the board. That means you're not an expert whatsoever, because you must know where your limits are, and you must be able to say, this is my limit. I cannot go any further. You can call this person or call that person to continue it. But if you don't do that, you're not an expert. You're worse than an expert or a non-expert, because now you kind of, it's not a fraud, but it's not the humility you must have. You got to have the arrogance of, yeah, I know, but you got to have the humility to say, yeah, but I don't know this much. And even to Graham's point on the developing processes and peer review type of processes, I think that's a great point to have. Well, for example, I'm finishing up a book on X-rays forensics, and what I've offered whoever uses X-rays forensics, if they have a process that they developed in that software program, whether it be there's one for hashing that someone submitted, some other things, so they can submit a process to me and Eric Zimmerman and Troy Larson. We're all going to look at these the processes that they developed, and we'll peer review them. If it works, we're putting it into the book. So you have a book on this software program, and we have contributions from X-rays users, forensic users, on things that they use it for, and it looks good. So now it's going to be published in a book. So for their expertise and their knowledge of a process that maybe they developed or they perfected, that builds toward their expertise. So they can legitimately say, I wrote something that's been peer reviewed. It's published. It's in use by thousands of people, across the world. So that is one nugget of expertise. So these contributions don't say, I know everything about a software, or I know everything, but it says, for this part, I know this, and this is what I've done, and it's been peer reviewed. For that, I'm expertise is I think qualification. Beyond that, that's a different subject. You need more stuff for that. But that humility of knowing what you don't know and saying, yeah, I don't know. It's embarrassing to say I don't know, but it's one of those things as part of being an expert. There's a lot more times you're going to say I don't know than I know. And as long as we can do that, I think that's the expertise is better.
Yeah, and it comes back to Graham's point as well about the skills that you need to go from I don't know to, now I do know, to be able to test and evaluate.
Yeah, I think that for example, like if you judge expertise based on purely what you've seen, I guess, then everyone's gonna stop, and we're gonna have loads and loads of things that we haven't seen for the first time, or are seen for the first time, and then all of a sudden we paralyze the entire discipline from not being able to offer commentary and support in an expert way for things that we need it. So we can't just put too many arbitrary factors and say, look, because everyone's expertise will stop, we'll grind to a halt, and we'll find we can't do anything. So we have to have some flexibility in moving your expertise forward. Because of the pace of change and things like that, the fact that we've got so much stuff coming through all the time, and what do we do when we see it for the first time? But that's the fine balance, I think. It's just, how do we do it? How do we get someone to a good quality level of knowledge when we've never really seen it that often before? But we need to trust someone, because someone needs to interpret and explain that information to us in a reliable way at a level that we might need them to do it, so that we can progress forward with some of the cases that involve that technology or something like that. So it's a tricky one. It's a tricky one. I don't think that, I certainly don't think that we've maybe solved any problems or anything like that. I don't, all I think we've done is probably highlighted some discussion points that exist maybe in this area, and maybe just to kind of insinuate that there's maybe a bit of self-criticality and reflection, just to think, am I not? If I am, why am I? And maybe think along those terms and things like that. Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
Makes sense.
I hope so.
It does. Graeme and Brett, thank you again for joining us on the Forensic Focus podcast.
Thank you.
Thanks also to our listeners. You'll be able to find this recording and transcription along with more articles, information, and forums at www.forensicfocus.com. Stay safe and well.